I thought I was winning, owning, adulting. 6 months in, I was broke and broken. She sold the condo, lost $40,000, gained her life back. I don't own property, but I own peace. Money 101 Mondays. Full episode, now playing on Dollar by Dollar. Watch the full story. Rent or buy. $200K housing mistake. Natalie Emerson pressed her hand against the granite countertop, cool to the touch, as if it could somehow anchor the flurry of emotions swarming inside her chest. The smell of freshly baked cookies still lingered in the air, a realtor's age-old trick. The open house was staged with just the right touch of aspirational living. Plush gray throws on the armchair, abstract art in all the right places, a record player humming soft jazz in the corner. It was perfect, too perfect. She could already see it, the life she'd carve inside these beige walls. Saturday mornings with coffee on the tiny balcony. The clink of glasses on Friday nights when her friends came over. The books she'd finally read, spread out across the built-in shelves. Her name on the deed, a symbol of having made it. A young couple brushed past her, wide-eyed and murmuring about school districts and walkable grocery stores. She stepped aside, but her gaze never left the kitchen tile. It was matte subway white. Clean. Minimal. Safe. Natalie didn't need another tour. She'd memorized the listing photos the night they went live. She knew every detail. The square footage, the HOA fees, the half-bath near the entryway that wasn't in the original layout but was cleverly added by the last owner. She wanted it. She wanted it so badly her hands trembled. But she didn't know what she didn't know. Not yet. At that moment, the dream was louder than the math. And that was the problem. 2 weeks earlier, Natalie had been in her apartment, watching her lease renewal deadline blink like a warning on her laptop calendar. Rent increase. $180 per month, the email had said. Again, she had already been on a tight budget. Her job as a marketing analyst paid her decently. $68,000 a year, plus an occasional bonus. But between student loans, rising groceries, and the slow leak of life's unplanned expenses, the increase made her stomach churn. Renting felt like bleeding slowly. Every dollar spent meant nothing built. She had nothing to show for the last 6 years of rent checks, except an overstuffed folder of renewal agreements and faded carbon copy receipts. She wanted equity, a foothold, something that wouldn't vanish when she closed the door behind her. So she Googled, is it better to rent or buy? And the answers came flooding in, overly confident and wildly optimistic. Stop throwing money away. Own your future. Build wealth through real estate. Rents are rising. Lock in a mortgage now before it's too late. Every blog post, every YouTube video, every Instagram finance reel seemed to whisper the same thing. If you're not buying, you're falling behind. And Natalie hated the idea of falling behind. Especially now, 34, single, and watching people half her age buy homes and post, just closed, selfies in front of wreath-covered doors. So she met with a lender. She had no idea what she was doing. The loan officer, a man named Jeremy with bright teeth and a too-firm handshake, made it all sound so easy. You're in good shape, he said. Your credit score is solid, and you've got enough for a down payment. You'll be surprised what we can get you into. He leaned in like they were conspiring. Interest rates just dropped again. It's the perfect time. It wasn't. But Natalie didn't know that. She had $42,000 in savings, half from years of careful saving, half from a modest inheritance her grandmother had left her. She planned to use $35,000 of it as her down payment and keep a cushion for repairs, just in case. That sounded responsible enough. And the monthly mortgage Jeremy showed her, only $300 more than her new rent would be. I mean, yeah, he said with a smile, you'll have taxes, insurance, HOA, but most of that's baked into your payment, and it's going towards something that's yours. His voice was confident, assured, the kind of tone that made you feel dumb for questioning anything. So Natalie signed the pre-approval papers, set up Redfin alerts, started touring units, and then she found it. The 2-bedroom condo in East Glendale. The one with the granite countertop. The one she couldn't stop dreaming about. Her best friend, Vanessa, was skeptical from the start. You sure you're ready for this? She asked one night over Thai takeout. Natalie nodded. I'm done throwing money away. It's time. But are you buying because it makes sense? Or, because you're scared to keep renting? Natalie bristled. Is there a difference? Vanessa sighed. I just don't want you to regret this. Regret, Natalie thought, was for people who never tried. And yet, she did hesitate. Quietly. Alone. Late at night, she'd stare at the mortgage calculator and tweak the numbers. If the HOA rose, if the market dropped, if she lost her job, what then? But she brushed those thoughts aside. Everyone she knew who bought said it was the best decision they'd ever made. So she made an offer. Full asking. Waived a few contingencies, just to stay competitive. Her offer was accepted within 6 hours. 6 hours. That's how long it took for her life to change. The closing process was a blur. Inspections, appraisals, disclosures with terms she half understood. Natalie signed pages until her wrist hurt, trusting that everyone in the room had her best interest in mind. She moved in with a sense of relief that bordered on euphoria. She painted the walls herself, bought secondhand furniture, and learned how to silence the squeaky cabinet in the bathroom. She posted her own, just closed, photo, smiling wide with the keys dangling in front of her door. For the first few months, it felt like she'd won. But underneath the surface, the cracks were already forming, and she didn't even see them coming. The first mortgage payment hit like a cold slap in the face. Natalie had seen the number before, on her closing documents, in her budget spreadsheet, in the mock-ups the lender had given her. $2,130.63. It wasn't a surprise, but seeing it drafted from her account in bold black text, it felt heavier. Final. She stared at her banking app as if the screen might blink and say, just kidding. Her rent had been $1,750 a month. Now she was paying almost $400 more, not including the HOA fee that snuck in a week later, $323.84. Then came the city utility bill. She hadn't paid for water before. Her old apartment included it. $94.22. Then garbage and recycling. $45.18. Homeowner's insurance. $57. Property tax escrow. $416. And rising. By the second month, she realized she wasn't paying $2,130 a month. She was paying close to $3,000. It didn't feel like ownership. It felt like a slow bleed. Natalie's condo had quirks that were charming when she toured it and irritating when she lived in it. The kitchen faucet leaked when turned a certain way. The balcony door jammed in the heat. The water heater let out a mysterious groan at 2 a.m., like an old man muttering in his sleep. But there was no landlord to call. It was hers. Every crack, every noise, every oddity, hers. Her neighbor Greg, a man with a stooped back and an encyclopedic knowledge of every HOA rule ever written, knocked on her door one morning. You left your recycling bin out past Wednesday again, he said. Natalie forced a polite smile. Sorry. Still adjusting. Greg didn't smile back. Everyone's expected to follow the rules. That's what keeps property values up. He turned and shuffled away, his clipboard tucked tightly under one arm. She closed the door and leaned against it. Property values. That phrase was already beginning to haunt her. 3 months in, the HVAC gave out. It was late July. Glendale hit 104 degrees, and her air conditioner groaned like it was dying of thirst. She called a local repair company. The technician arrived with the kind of tired eyes that said he had 6 more homes to visit and a backlog of parts on order. He ran a few tests, poked at wires, and frowned. Well, he said, compressor's going. Could be $1,200 to repair. But if the coil's rusted, which it looks like, might as well replace the whole thing. Natalie blinked. How much is that? Full system. About $5,400. She laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was the kind of number that made your brain short-circuit. She stared at her savings account later that night. $7,410. The number looked smaller than ever. She paid the emergency fee to get the unit patched, not replaced. It cost her $1,489 and a weekend of sweating in her own home. In her 4th month of ownership, Natalie started to see numbers differently. She no longer saw rent as throwing money away. She saw it as buying flexibility. And what had she bought instead? A monthly burden, a sinking cushion of savings, a long list of just-in-case maintenance tasks she had no time or knowledge to handle. She kept telling herself it would get better, that she'd adjust, that homeownership was always hard at first. But she couldn't shake the thought that she'd run the wrong numbers. Back when she was deciding, she'd found dozens of rent versus buy calculators online, but they were all skewed. Most assumed you'd stay in the home for 7+ years. Most assumed the market would go up. Most assumed you'd reinvest the savings from renting. Most didn't account for special assessments from the HOA, or inflation in condo insurance, or rising maintenance costs in older buildings. She remembered one calculator had told her, if home values go up by 3% annually, you'll break even in year 6. But home values don't rise in straight lines. They dip. They stall. They sometimes plummet. And that 3%, it was optimistic at best. The year after she bought, the local market flattened. Then came the interest rate spike, and suddenly people weren't bidding full price anymore. Suddenly her unit was worth less than what she paid. She didn't want to look. But one night, she couldn't help herself. She opened Redfin and searched her building. A unit just like hers, same layout, same finishes, had just gone up for sale at $14,000 less than what she'd paid. Her stomach dropped. The words price reduced glared in red. Natalie felt trapped. Selling would mean losing money. Not just the down payment, but also the closing costs, the agent's commission, the thousands she'd sunk into the AC, the insurance, the property taxes. And renting again? That felt like admitting defeat. She couldn't tell her parents. They were so proud of her when she bought. Her dad had shaken her hand like she'd crossed some invisible threshold into adulthood. She couldn't tell Vanessa either. Not after ignoring her warnings. Instead, she opened Excel, made a new spreadsheet titled, Cost of Owning versus Cost of Renting, 3-year Outlook. She added every column she could think of: mortgage interest, principal, insurance, taxes, HOA, average monthly maintenance, emergency fund depletion. She added a line for opportunity cost, how much money she could have made if she'd left that $35,000 inheritance in an index fund. The bottom line was brutal. If she'd stayed renting and invested the difference, she would have been ahead by almost $29,000 in just 2 years. And that didn't include the emotional toll. It's not that buying was always a mistake. It was that buying too soon was. She hadn't run a full projection. She hadn't considered market cycles. She hadn't imagined losing flexibility, paying for repairs, dealing with HOA politics, or carrying debt on a depreciating asset. She had thought about owning, but she never asked, owning what? Then came the special assessment. A pipe burst in the underground garage. It wasn't covered by insurance. Each unit owner owed $3,600, due in 90 days. Natalie stared at the letter from the HOA board. It felt like a punishment. She was down to $5,300 in savings. She could put it on her credit card, or dip into the last of her emergency fund. Either way, the condo was costing her far more than she'd planned, far more than she could keep affording. And for what? She still worked the same job, still had student loans, still lived in a modest space. But now she was house poor. She wasn't building wealth. She was drowning slowly, beneath granite countertops and staged dreams. The worst part? It was preventable. If she had slowed down, if she had questioned the narrative, if she had asked different questions, not how much can I afford, but does this make sense for me? But she hadn't, and the guilt was heavy. One night, Natalie sat on the balcony, knees to her chest, watching traffic blur into streaks below. Her wine glass was half empty. Her phone was glowing with another article she didn't want to read. 2024 Housing Market Update. Prices dip in key metro areas. She didn't need to click it. She already knew. She was living in a $453,000 mistake, and she had to find a way out. Natalie Emerson sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, her back resting against the closet door, a half-folded pile of laundry beside her. It was nearly midnight. Her inbox buzzed with work emails, but she didn't check them. She couldn't. Her thoughts were stuck on something else, something deeper than a budget, more primal than bills. She felt stuck, not just financially, emotionally, existentially. The condo that was supposed to represent progress now felt like a trap with painted walls and staged lighting. She looked around her room, at the carefully chosen furniture, the soft gray comforter, the wall art she hung with such pride just 8 months ago. And it all felt like props now. Props in a place she no longer believed in. The irony was suffocating. She had done everything right. Got a stable job, paid her bills, built her credit, saved for a down payment, bought the property, secured the mortgage. And yet here she was, crying quietly into a Target throw pillow because she couldn't afford dinner out with friends anymore without checking her balance 3 times. She had gone from a woman with options to a woman calculating the price of toilet paper in unit cost per sheet. She was, for the first time in her adult life, house poor. The signs had been subtle at first. A missed birthday dinner because of work, turning down concert invites with vague excuses, bringing Tupperware meals to the office instead of joining the team at the sandwich shop down the block. She told herself she was being responsible, focused, disciplined. But the truth crept in slowly, like mold behind fresh paint. Natalie wasn't just cutting back. She was isolating. She was afraid. Afraid of checking her credit score. Afraid of getting sick and needing urgent care. Afraid of what one layoff could do to everything she'd built. And worse, afraid of admitting this to anyone. Because wasn't buying a home supposed to be the grown-up thing? The financially smart thing? She had wanted to be proud of herself. Instead, she felt ashamed. At the office, her coworker Jordan was glowing, showing off photos of the Italy trip he'd taken with his girlfriend. Natalie smiled politely. "That's the Amalfi Coast," Jordan beamed. "The whole thing cost us like $2,800 because we booked it during shoulder season." "That's amazing," Natalie said, sipping her 4th black coffee of the morning. "You guys earned it." He looked at her with a curious tilt. "You and anyone?" Natalie shook her head. "Just me. The condo's my baby right now." He smiled, but she could sense the pity behind it. Grown-up stuff. He had no idea, because behind the walls of that condo, Natalie wasn't thriving. She was surviving. Barely. Groceries became an equation. $5.19 for oat milk, or $3.17 for dairy. Pasta 3 nights in a row. Meat once a week. If that. She switched to a generic brand toothpaste that tasted like metal. She stopped using her heating system entirely after November, layering hoodies and socks instead. Little acts of compromise, none dramatic on their own, but together, they were carving pieces from her spirit. And every night she returned to the same granite countertop that once made her giddy. Now it felt like stone around her neck. One weekend, her college friend Leah came to visit from Portland. "Your place is gorgeous," Leah said as she twirled into the living room. "Ugh, this balcony. You really bought this on your own?" Natalie nodded, a weak smile stretching across her face. "Yep, closed last spring." "That's so adult of you," Leah laughed. "Meanwhile, I'm still renting and blowing money on travel and espresso." Natalie hesitated. Leah continued, "But hey, you're building equity, right? That's what they say." Natalie wanted to scream, because the words didn't land the way they used to. Equity. Not if the market was down. Not if she had to sell at a loss. Not if every month she drained her savings just to survive. "I guess," Natalie replied, reaching for her lukewarm coffee. "I'm learning a lot." That night, after Leah left, Natalie lay in bed staring at the ceiling. The streetlight outside painted slow-moving shadows on her walls. She wasn't angry at Leah. She was angry at the story she'd been told. Buy a home and build wealth. Renting is for people who can't afford to buy. Homeownership is always a step up. But no one had said what to do if that step up landed you on the edge of a financial cliff. No one said, if you're single, with a modest income, and no emergency fund after the down payment, wait. No one said, run the numbers for your market, your risk tolerance, your timeline. No one said, owning a home is not a life upgrade. It's a job. And she'd signed a contract thinking she was graduating. But in truth, she was enrolling in a course she hadn't studied for. And tuition was due every month, with interest. The emotional toll was invisible to most. But it was real. She felt a knot in her chest every time a bill came in. She stopped sleeping through the night. She double-checked her auto-pay settings like a nervous tick. She no longer felt free. She felt owned. And yet, ironically, she owned the space. Technically. One Thursday night, she opened her journal for the first time in months. On the first page, she wrote in block letters, "What is this really costing me?" She didn't mean financially. She meant her peace, her health, her time, her relationships, her joy. She listed them all. Skipped cousin's wedding in Boston. Can't afford the flight. Canceled therapy. Copay too high. Ignored toothache. Dental deductible resets in January. Declined coworker's birthday dinner. Not in the budget. Said no to date night. Too embarrassed to admit I'm broke. The list went on. She looked at the page, then looked around her room. She had traded her life for a mortgage, and it wasn't a fair deal. That weekend, something shifted. She woke up early, pulled on a hoodie, made tea, and opened her laptop, not to check her mortgage, but to research something different. How to rent out your condo legally, she typed. Then, how much rent can I charge in Glendale? Then, what happens if you sell a home at a loss? The searches were quiet, almost shameful, but they were a start, the beginning of questioning a decision that had, until now, gone unchallenged. She wasn't ready to sell. Not yet. But for the first time, she was ready to admit something deeply important. Buying a home hadn't made her feel secure, and that meant she had to start figuring out how to fix that, on her own terms. Because financial mistakes don't define you. They refine you. And Natalie? She was just getting started. It started with the gym membership. Natalie stood at the counter of her overpriced fitness studio, the kind with cold towels and eucalyptus mist, and told the receptionist in her peppy tank top, "I need to cancel my membership." "Is everything okay?" the woman asked, blinking behind fake lashes. "I just can't justify it right now." She said it gently, like a confession. The girl behind the desk nodded slowly, tapping on her keyboard. "Totally understand. We do have a freeze option if you want to pause instead of cancel." "No," Natalie said firmly, more firmly than she expected. "Cancel it, please." It was the first no of many, and once it came out of her mouth, the others followed like dominoes. Natalie had spent months inside the walls of her mortgage. But now, something had shifted. She was no longer pretending this life was sustainable. She was no longer clinging to the idea that owning was inherently superior. She was doing what she should have done months earlier, auditing her life, ruthlessly. And the first thing to go was the illusion of normal spending. She opened her budget spreadsheet on a quiet Sunday morning and renamed the file. The year of saying no. Then, she started cutting. Streaming services, gone. Meal kit delivery, gone. Designer skincare, replaced with generic drugstore brands. Credit card autopay for boutique purchases, canceled. It wasn't frugality for show. This wasn't about latte shaming or minimalism aesthetics. It was survival. Intentional survival. She printed out her bank statements, got out 4 highlighters, and color-coded every dollar that didn't align with basic needs. The page was a rainbow of regret. But instead of wallowing, she studied it like a roadmap. And quietly, methodically, she began to reverse the damage. She called her student loan servicer and adjusted her payment plan. She dropped her cell phone plan to a prepaid carrier and saved $44 a month. She sold 3 handbags on Poshmark, earning enough to cover a month's worth of groceries. It wasn't glamorous. There were no viral TikToks, no Pinterest perfect budget boards, but there was dignity. Because for the first time since buying the condo, Natalie felt like she was in motion again, no longer trapped, just realigned. She also said no to social guilt. When coworkers planned happy hour at a rooftop bar, she declined with honesty. "Not in my budget right now," she said one day when Jordan asked. He blinked. "Want me to cover your first round?" She smiled. "That's kind. But this isn't about a drink. It's about making different choices." He didn't press, just nodded. Respect. That one word gave her a jolt of relief. Because in the quiet corners of struggle, dignity doesn't come from pretending. It comes from transparency. Her social calendar shrank, but her life expanded in unexpected ways. She started walking instead of driving. Not because it was trendy, but because it saved gas. She discovered an old hiking trail 5 blocks from her place and started going every Saturday morning, rain or shine. With no gym and no dinner dates, she learned to make soups from scratch. Lentil, chickpea, cabbage. Soups that cost $4 to make and lasted 3 days. She read books she already owned. She fixed a leaky faucet by watching a YouTube video twice and using a borrowed wrench. She stopped ordering anything online, unless it was toilet paper or cat food. And with every dollar she didn't spend, a kind of peace settled over her. It wasn't that she loved this stripped-down version of her life. It was that it finally matched her reality. The condo hadn't changed, but she had. Of course, not everything was easy. Sometimes the loneliness pressed hard against her ribcage. Sometimes she saw photos of friends in Greece or Tokyo and felt like she was living in black and white while the rest of the world thrived in color. And yet, even on the grayest days, there was something solid beneath her feet, a kind of integrity she'd never known. Because Natalie was no longer buying the story. She was writing a new one. Midway through the year, she started keeping a tiny notebook called The Good I Kept. Every time she said no to something, she wrote down what she kept instead. I said no to sushi. I kept $46. I said no to an Uber. I kept my dignity and walked. I said no to that sweater. I kept space in my closet. I said no to hosting book club. I kept my energy. I said no to pretending. I kept the truth. The notebook became a lifeline, a reminder that every no was an act of preservation. And somewhere along the way, those no's stopped feeling like losses. They felt like boundaries. By October, she'd rebuilt her emergency fund to $6,700. She didn't touch it. Just knowing it was there, like a soft landing if the world tilted, brought a calm she hadn't felt in over a year. And that calm gave her clarity. Because once she stepped off the treadmill of appearances, she saw clearly what she wanted. Not granite countertops. Not equity. Not status or square footage or Pinterest-worthy entryways. She wanted freedom. And freedom, she realized, didn't always come from ownership. Sometimes, it came from undoing what no longer served you, even if that meant walking away. One night, Natalie sat on her balcony with a cup of tea and wrote a letter in her journal. It was addressed to herself, 2 years in the future. Dear future me, she wrote, I hope you're proud of the moment you stopped pretending. I hope you remember that owning a home didn't define your worth, and that saying no didn't shrink your life, it expanded it. I hope you forgive yourself for believing a myth and celebrate yourself for breaking free of it. She paused, then added, and if you ever forget who you are, remember this. You said no to survive. You said no to breathe. You said no to reclaim your future. She closed the notebook with quiet reverence. Because the truth was simple. Sometimes, saying no is the most powerful yes there is. And Natalie? She had just begun saying yes to the right things. It began with a postcard. Cream-colored cardstock with elegant gold letters. Are you overpaying for your mortgage? Refinance today. Natalie would have thrown it out, like the dozens before it, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the way the marketing played off the edges of her own exhaustion. Or maybe it was just curiosity. She hadn't looked at her mortgage terms in over a year. Not really. Not with fresh eyes. She had locked in at 4.4%, not bad at the time, but rates had dropped for certain categories, and her loan officer had mentioned the market was adjusting again. If she could shave even a half-point off her rate, she might save a few $100s a month. And those dollars, those mattered now. She hesitated at first. Was refinancing just another trap? Another clever illusion, dressed up as a solution? But in the spirit of her year of saying no, Natalie decided to do something different. Say maybe. She called a number. Booked the consult. A week later, she sat at her kitchen table with a tablet in one hand and a cup of cheap instant coffee in the other. The lender, a woman named Diana, was calm, methodical, and refreshingly honest. Let's run your numbers, Diana said over the video call. You're not locked into anything unless you sign. Natalie appreciated the tone. Professional, not pushy. They went through the basics. Loan balance, credit score, which had improved since she cut her spending, debt-to-income ratio. You're in decent shape, Diana said. We might be able to lower your monthly payment by a couple hundred. But first, we'll need to schedule an appraisal. That word landed like a small thunderclap in Natalie's chest. Appraisal. It had been 14 months since she bought the condo for $453,000. And in those 14 months, the world had changed. Rates had risen. The local market had cooled. Neighboring units were sitting unsold. HOA fees had climbed again. She nodded slowly. Okay, let's do it. The appraiser arrived on a Thursday afternoon. He was polite, older, wore glasses and khakis that looked starched. He moved quietly through the space, clipboard in hand, muttering measurements and floor plan terms. Natalie tried to stay out of the way. She stood in the corner of the living room, arms crossed, pretending to check email on her phone. But internally, she was calculating, worrying. She had seen the listings. She knew the market. But she didn't know. And the not knowing clawed at her stomach. The appraiser smiled briefly before leaving. You should get the report in a couple days. Great, Natalie said, but her voice cracked. She didn't sleep well that weekend. She told herself not to refresh her email. And she did. 37 times. The report came on Monday morning. The subject line was short. Appraisal results. Emerson unit number 204. She stared at it for several seconds before clicking. Her eyes scanned the summary. Estimated market value. $399,000. The number didn't register at first. It didn't fit the mental map she had been drawing. $399,000. That was $54,000 less than what she paid. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad. She reread the section again. Based on local market comparables and current listing performance, the unit is currently valued at $399,000. Her breath caught in her throat. $54,000. Gone. Not in theory, not in potential value, but in cold, documented loss. And that didn't include the $8,200 she'd paid in interest so far, or the $3,700 in special assessments, or the $6,400 in maintenance, or the $5,000 from her savings she would never get back. Natalie closed the laptop slowly. Her body went still, not from panic, from clarity, because in that moment, she realized something that would change her entire path. She had been trying to save a ship that was already sinking. Later that night, she wrote a single sentence in her journal. Would I buy this home today, knowing what I now know? She stared at the words. No. The answer was no. So why was she holding on to it? Because of pride? Because she was afraid to admit she'd made a mistake? Because it was hers? Those were all emotional reasons. And emotion had already cost her too much. She needed a plan, not a panic. A plan grounded in truth. So she began exploring options. She made lists, wrote timelines, created a spreadsheet labeled Exit Strategy, What Would It Take? At first, the math was discouraging. If she sold at $399,000, she'd still owe the remaining balance on her mortgage, about $437,000. That meant she'd need to bring nearly $40,000 to the table just to walk away. But if she rented the unit instead, she could list it at $2,300 per month, maybe $2,400 if she found a long-term tenant. HOA and mortgage combined were still close to $2,800. It wouldn't be profitable, but would buy her time. She started researching negative cash flow properties. Not ideal, but possible. She ran projections for 12 months, then 24. If she held on until the market recovered. If she scraped together emergency reserves. If she took on a side gig to cover the rental gap. Maybe, just maybe, she could reposition her mistake into a stepping stone. She spent the next week reading articles, forums, real estate blogs. She devoured every story of people who had bought wrong and still came out the other side. She made a list of lessons, scribbled in the margins of her notebook. Buying a home is not always cheaper than renting. Equity is not guaranteed. Owning means responsibility, not freedom. You're not a failure for selling. A financial mistake does not define you. They became her mantras, not for guilt, for growth. A month later, she had an answer. She would rent out the unit, take a small loss monthly, pick up part-time consulting to close the gap, move into a smaller apartment across town, and breathe again. It wouldn't be glamorous, but it would be progress. And more importantly, it would be hers, her choice, not the market's, not society's, not her parents', not her past selves, hers. The day she listed the unit on Zillow, she felt a knot loosen in her chest. Photos uploaded, description entered, price set. A quiet rebellion against shame. Because acknowledging a mistake, publicly, clearly, with strategy, is not weakness. It's power. It's clarity. It's growth in real time. Natalie wasn't walking away from her home. She was walking toward her future. One she could afford. One she could design. One where granite countertops didn't matter nearly as much as mental peace. And that was the real equity she'd been missing all along. The U-Haul wasn't even half full. Natalie stared at the scattered boxes in the cargo space. Some marked kitchen, others books, one just labeled life. A mattress leaned crookedly on the side, strapped by a single bungee cord. That was it. Everything she now owned. It fit in a 12-foot truck, and she'd never felt lighter. The condo keys jingled on a separate ring now. She wasn't selling yet, but the listing was live. The lease on her new place, An 850 square foot one-bedroom on the east side was signed. First month's rent and deposit paid. It wasn't luxury, but it was hers. On her terms. No HOA meetings. No surprise special assessments. No sinking feeling when the air conditioner coughed. She was a renter again. But this time, it didn't feel like failure. It felt like freedom. The new apartment sat above a corner bookstore and smelled faintly of espresso and old paper. The floors creaked with charm. The windows were drafty, but wide enough to let in the morning sun. There was no balcony, no stainless steel appliances, no double sinks. But there was breathing room. Emotional breathing room. Rent was $1,690. A number that once would have made her nervous. Now felt like a discount compared to her mortgage and HOA. And best of all, that $1,690 came with a clear boundary. If the water heater broke, not her problem. If the garage gate jammed, someone else's job. The invisible weight that had been crushing her chest for over a year was gone. Not erased, but lifted. And Natalie could finally stand up straight. The first night in the new place, she unpacked a single box, kitchen basics. One pan, one pot, two plates, a coffee mug that said, progress, not perfection. She cooked rice and beans on her stove and sat cross-legged on the floor, eating from a chipped bowl. No TV, no furniture yet. And still she smiled. Because this meal, this moment, was hers alone. No house-poor guilt. No granite countertops mocking her anxiety. Just warmth, simplicity, and the distinct feeling that, for the first time in months, she had made a decision that expanded her life instead of shrinking it. Her phone buzzed that weekend. It was a text from a prospective tenant for the condo. Saw your listing on Zillow. Still available? Natalie's heart picked up pace. She replied, yes. Are you available to tour this week? She arranged 3 viewings. Cleaned the space herself. Made sure the blinds were open and the air smelled like citrus cleaner instead of regret. The first woman to walk through, a dental assistant named Tara, spent 20 minutes walking the unit, then turned and said, I love it. It's quiet. Feels solid. Natalie nodded. It is. And I'm looking for a long-term renter, someone who'll treat it like home. Tara smiled. I've been in my current place for 5 years. I'm not into moving every year. Natalie held her breath as she handed over the rental application. 2 days later, Tara was approved. Natalie signed the lease electronically and exhaled so deeply she startled herself. It was done. She was a landlord now. An accidental one. A reluctant one. But for the first time since buying the condo, it was producing value. Not draining it. Even if she was losing $350 per month to the rent gap, that was manageable. Especially now that she was no longer hemorrhaging cash and hidden costs. And every dollar she didn't spend on maintaining appearances, she saved, dollar by dollar. Her new routine was simple. Wake up, coffee, freelance, writing 2 evenings a week, weekly phone calls with her cousin in Denver, hikes every Saturday, library card reactivated. She built her life from the inside out this time, not around what it looked like, but how it felt. And what it felt like was peace. Not the kind you buy. The kind you fight for. Friends started noticing. You seem lighter, her friend Vanessa said during a Sunday walk. Natalie smiled. I am. Still in the condo. Nope, she said, kicking a pine cone off the path. I'm moved. Renting now. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. Really? I thought you were going to stick it out. I was, Natalie said. But then I realized. Owning wasn't the problem. Owning too early was. Vanessa nodded slowly. I'm proud of you. Natalie looked ahead at the path, sun flickering between the trees. I'm proud of me too. She tracked her finances obsessively, not because she was scared, but because she finally understood the power in paying attention. She created a Google sheet titled Wealth Rebuild and watched her emergency fund grow from $6,700 to $9,100 over 4 months. She opened a high-yield savings account. Moved her leftover inheritance into a total stock market index fund. She took a free online course on real estate basics, not because she planned to become a mogul, but because she refused to make the same mistake twice. Knowledge, she realized, was the best form of rent she could pay to her future self. One night, Natalie sat on her floor, still no couch, still no problem, and reread the appraisal report. $399,000. The number no longer made her feel sick. It made her feel strong, because she had faced it, owned it, adapted. She pulled out her journal and wrote, "I thought renting meant I failed. But it turns out, freedom doesn't care whether you own the keys. It cares whether you own your decisions." And now, she did. She still had moments of doubt. When she saw another Instagram post of someone buying their first home. When her parents asked, "Do you think you'll buy again?" But she didn't flinch anymore. She had made peace with her journey. All of it. And peace, she learned, wasn't a place. It was a perspective. 3 months later, Tara texted her. "Just want to say I love the place. Feels like home already." Natalie smiled. Type back, "I'm so glad. Let me know if anything comes up." She paused, then added, "Enjoy it." And she meant it, because it no longer had to be hers to matter. She didn't need to possess the walls to feel whole again. She was richer now, not in equity, not in assets, but in the rarest currency of all. Wisdom hard-earned, freedom reclaimed, and a life, finally, aligned with truth. It came on a Thursday morning, tucked between a dental reminder and a promo code for 20% off running shoes. Subject, position opening, marketing strategy led. Natalie almost deleted it. She thought it was spam. But something about the sender's name made her pause. It was from Alana Bradford, a former client, one she had worked with 2 years ago during a contract project that almost broke her. Alana had been a VP at a mid-sized sustainability startup. Natalie remembered her as sharp, relentless, always a step ahead of the room. Their paths had crossed when Natalie was brought on as a contractor to rework brand messaging. The budget was tight, the demands high, but Natalie had delivered, on time, under cost, and with metrics to back it. They hadn't spoken since. She clicked the email. "Hi, Natalie. I've been following your career. We're finally in a place to expand. We're building a new division focused on long-term brand positioning. You came to mind immediately. Would you be open to talking?" "Best, Alana." Natalie blinked. Twice. Then she exhaled so hard she startled her cat off the windowsill. She hadn't been on the market. She wasn't even thinking about making a move. After the condo fallout, all she wanted was stability. But this wasn't noise. This was signal. And her gut, the same one that had been silenced in that open house a year ago, was speaking up again. "This is different. Pay attention." They met for coffee the next day. Natalie wore her best blazer. It had been tucked in the back of her closet since the condo purchase, rarely worn. She ran a brush through her hair 3 times. Wiped her glasses. Breathed slowly in the cafe bathroom before stepping out to the patio. Alana was already there, sipping espresso and scrolling her phone. She looked up and smiled. "Natalie, I was hoping you'd say yes." They talked for 90 minutes. The role was real. The pay was generous. $102,000 base, plus equity and a flexible remote setup. It would be demanding, but strategic. Big picture work, not just a grind. Natalie listened. Asked questions, took notes. But what struck her more than the numbers was the tone. Alana respected her. Not for her resume, not for where she lived, but for how she thought. It reminded Natalie of something she'd forgotten. She had value beyond her possessions, beyond titles, beyond the square footage of her kitchen. And when Alana asked, "So, what do you think?" Natalie smiled. "I think I'm ready." She didn't sleep that night, not because she was anxious, but because her brain was alive again. She sat on the floor of her apartment at midnight, writing in her journal under the flicker of a lamp. "I almost let a mortgage shrink me. Now I'm letting opportunity expand me." The contrast wasn't lost on her. Buying the condo had felt like crossing into adulthood. But this, owning her time, her talent, her direction, this felt like real maturity. She accepted the offer 3 days later. And just like that, her story took another turn. The new job changed everything. Not overnight, but slowly, steadily. She woke up each morning not just to clock in, but to create, to build, to think deeply about strategy, about messaging, about meaning. She finally understood what people meant when they said, "I feel aligned." It wasn't just the paycheck, though that helped. It was the energy, the agency, and the freedom. Her budget changed too. With a higher income, she started rebuilding more than just her savings. She opened a Roth IRA, increased her emergency fund goal from $10,000 to $20,000. She scheduled appointments she'd been putting off, dentist, therapist, optometrist. She even signed up for a pottery class on Thursday nights. Not because it was productive, but because it brought her joy. A kind of joy that granite countertops never could. She didn't rush to upgrade her life. No fancy car, no apartment makeover, no revenge spending. Instead, she created a file called Redemption Plan. At the top, she wrote, "Make every dollar serve you, not shame you." She put $200 into an OOPS fund, money specifically set aside to soften the sting of future mistakes. She labeled another tab, Freedom Account, a savings pot for future flexibility, because she didn't want to be house rich and life poor ever again. She wanted choices, options, exit plans, and now she was finally building those on purpose. Months passed. Her renter paid on time. The rental gap tightened with each raise she received. She found a rhythm in her new role. Her confidence deepened not from what she owned, but from how she operated. And that internal shift changed how she moved through the world. When people asked where she lived, she no longer hesitated. "I rent a little place above a bookstore. It's perfect." And it was. Because it was no longer about proving anything. It was about living well with awareness. Then came the phone call from her mother. It was casual at first, just to check in. "How's the new job?" "Good. Fulfilling." "And the condo?" "Still renting it out." "It's working." There was a pause. "Do you think you'll buy again someday?" Natalie smiled at the ceiling. "Maybe," she said, "but not until I'm buying for the right reasons." "What does that mean?" "It means I know now that ownership isn't freedom. Intentionality is." Her mother didn't argue, just said, "I'm proud of you, Nat." Natalie felt something warm bloom in her chest. Because for the first time, she was proud too. Not because she had it all figured out, but because she'd been wrong and recovered. Because she'd lost money but gained wisdom. Because she had dared to change direction when everything in her world said to stay still. The email that changed everything hadn't just offered her a job. It offered her a mirror. A reminder that her worth was not tied to a deed, or a status, or a story she'd once believed. It was tied to her resilience and the courage to course correct. And that was priceless. It was supposed to be just another Tuesday. Natalie was in her home office, sipping black coffee from her chipped Progress, not perfection, mug, preparing a presentation on brand pivots during recessions. Her Slack pinged 3 times in a row, urgent client input. She pulled up the deck, adjusted a few slides, hit send. Then, without thinking, she clicked the Zillow tab she kept pinned. It had become a reflex, a quiet routine she checked like weather. Harmless curiosity, no intention behind it. But something was different this time. She blinked. The condo next to hers, the mirror unit with the same layout, same square footage, and same south-facing view, had just been listed for $456,000. Natalie blinked again. $456,000. That was $3,000 more than what she had paid, and more than $50,000 higher than the last comp she had seen just 6 months ago. She opened the listing. Photos were staged, but not special. Same floors, same layout. The only difference? The market had shifted. Interest rates had dropped after months of holding. Buyers were back. Inventory was still tight. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad. Was this a fluke? She searched again. For more units in her building had gone pending in the last 8 weeks. 2 with accepted offers above list price. Natalie sat back in her chair. For the first time since the appraisal, her property was no longer underwater. It was floating, maybe even sailing. And with that realization came the return of a familiar weight. But this time, it didn't land with dread. It landed with possibility. She paced her apartment for the next hour. Tea forgotten. Slack notifications blinking unanswered. Her mind was loud. Could I really sell it now? Is it worth the risk? What would I do with the money? Would this erase the mistake, or just reshape it? She pulled up her spreadsheet. Exit strategy. What would it take? She added a new column. Spring 2025 sale projection. If she listed at $455K. If she paid out the 6% agent commission. If she deducted closing costs, capital gains exclusions, and final loan payoff, she could walk away with around $28,000. It wasn't profit, but it wasn't a loss either. Not anymore. It was something else entirely. Closure. That night, she called Vanessa. "I think I'm going to sell," she said. not bothering with a greeting. Vanessa didn't respond right away. Then, "Are you sure?" "No," Natalie laughed. "But I'm getting close." "Why now?" "The market turned. I could finally break even. Maybe better. Wouldn't make you feel free." Natalie thought about that. And not just financially. Would letting go of the condo untie her from the guilt, the lessons, the tension she'd carried for 2 years? She nodded into the phone. "Yeah, I think it would." She gave herself 2 weeks to decide. She didn't want to act out of impulse. Instead, she journaled, walked, ran numbers 5 different ways, called a real estate agent she trusted, a soft-spoken woman named Priya who specialized in quiet exits. "I don't need fireworks," Natalie told her. "I need strategy." Priya smiled through the phone. "We'll keep it quiet. Efficient. Clean." They scheduled a walkthrough. Priya visited the unit and nodded approvingly. "You took good care of it," she said. Natalie laughed. "That's debatable. It feels like a home," Priya said. "That's what buyers are looking for. And maybe that's what Natalie was finally ready to give them." She told Tara, the tenant, a few days later, respectfully and early. "I may be listing the condo soon," she said over tea on the patio. "If so, you get full notice and, of course, first right to stay through your lease." Tara nodded. "Honestly, I've been considering a move next year anyway. If it lines up, that works for me." Natalie breathed a little easier. No conflict, no drama, just adults sharing space and transitions. It felt grown-up. The listing went live in early April. Natalie didn't post about it, didn't tell her parents until the open house had come and gone. She didn't want advice. She didn't want opinions. She wanted clarity. The listing price, $459,000. She braced herself. Offers came quickly. 3 within 4 days. 1 all cash. 1 contingent on financing. 1 with a slightly higher price but a longer escrow window. She sat with them, reread every line of every letter. But it was the all-cash offer that made her hands tremble. $452,500. No contingencies. 21-day close. Clear and clean. She forwarded it to Priya. "Let's accept," she wrote. 2 minutes later, it was done. Natalie leaned back in her chair, closed her laptop, and whispered aloud, "It's really happening." Escrow moved fast. She signed papers at her tiny kitchen table. This time, she read every page, understood every term, asked every question she didn't know the answer to. Not because she didn't trust them, but because she finally trusted herself. And that changed everything. The wire hit her account 3 weeks later. $26,114.89. Not a jackpot. Not life-changing. But life-realigning. She didn't celebrate with champagne. She made soup, lit a candle, sat on her floor, and wrote one last entry in the condo journal she had kept since that first open house. "This place wasn't my forever. It wasn't my freedom. But it was my teacher. And now I graduate." She closed the book, then opened a new one. What she did next was deliberate. She didn't rush to reinvest the money. She opened a high-interest account, labeled it Foundation Fund. She set a 3-month spending freeze. No big purchases. Just observation. She booked a session with a fee-only financial advisor. She began planning a trip she had delayed for years. Not to escape, but to reflect. Lisbon. 1 week. Just her, a journal, and a backpack. And for once, the flight didn't feel like a splurge. It felt like sovereignty. Selling the condo didn't erase the past. It didn't refund her interest payments or undo the stress. But it redeemed the experience. Because she had come full circle, not with blind optimism, but with earned insight. And when people asked, "Do you regret buying?" she answered carefully, "I regret why I bought. Not that I bought. Because mistakes are only permanent if you ignore them." And she hadn't. She had learned. She had adapted. She had walked away, not from responsibility, but toward integrity. And in doing so, she reclaimed not just her finances, but herself. Natalie didn't buy anything impulsively after the sale. No shiny car. No high-end laptop. Not even the mid-century dresser she'd been eyeing on Facebook Marketplace for months. Instead, she walked to the library. She picked up a book on behavioral finance, another on minimalist living, and 1 novel. Because joy was part of her wealth now, too. She spent that first week after escrow in a kind of hush. The kind of silence that follows a storm. Not empty, Just wide and clear, a silence with room to breathe. She was a renter again, yes. But this time, she felt sovereign, because what she had now couldn't be repossessed. It wasn't about the deed. It was about the discipline. It wasn't about what she owned. It was about what no longer owned her. She opened her budget sheet again, now titled Life Reimagined, and made the first of many changes. Under housing, she set her rent at $1,690. Under savings rate, she increased her target from 20% to 35%. Under non-negotiables, she wrote, therapy, emergency fund, creative time, travel once a year, saying no without apology. It wasn't a spreadsheet anymore. It was a compass. And for the first time, she knew exactly where she was heading. Lisbon came 2 weeks later. She booked an off-season flight, found a studio Airbnb with pale pink walls and a rooftop terrace that overlooked the orange-tiled city. She packed light, left her work laptop at home, brought a fresh notebook and a pair of walking shoes. She spent her mornings with coffee and pastéis de nata on park benches, her afternoons wandering Alfama's tangled alleys, her nights journaling beneath hanging lanterns. No itinerary, no pressure. She called it her decompression pilgrimage. And it worked. Because in those quiet, cobbled streets, Natalie began to see her life through a different lens. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a blueprint. A messy, flawed, gorgeous blueprint for what happens when you stop performing and start listening. One night, halfway through the trip, she sat alone on a rooftop terrace sipping red wine, the air cool and sea-salted. She wrote, maybe the lesson isn't to avoid mistakes. Maybe it's to own them with so much clarity they become your scaffolding. Maybe it's not about having a perfect record. Maybe it's about having a story worth retelling, with your name still intact. She looked out at the sloping roofs and the church towers and felt something deep and unmapped within her settle. This was what ownership meant to her now. Owning her time, owning her energy, owning her reactions, owning her recovery. She didn't need property for that. She just needed presence. Back home, she kept living differently. She still rented, still packed her lunch, still said no when she needed to. But now she did it from a place of knowing, not fear. Knowing that a home wasn't a finish line. Knowing that equity in real estate meant nothing without equity in self. She kept a jar on her desk, small, glass, filled with folded slips of paper. On each one, a moment she had chosen clarity over performance. Said no to brunch I didn't want. Told the truth about burnout. Didn't explain my budget. Walked away from a debate I didn't need to win. She called it her ownership jar. Not because she owned things, but because she was finally owning herself. People noticed. Her posture changed. She took up space, not loudly, but with calm. She spoke slower, made fewer apologies. Her yes were clean. Her no's were without guilt. When friends asked about the condo, she didn't deflect. I sold it, she said. Did you make money? Someone asked once at a dinner party. Natalie smiled. I made peace. That's worth more. She began mentoring, quietly, one-on-one, younger women in her field who were asking the same question she had asked at 30. Should I buy now? Is renting a waste? How do I stop feeling behind? She didn't give advice. She gave perspective. Ask yourself what you're really trying to buy, she told one mentee. Security? Status? Stability. And if it's stability, she added, ask whether you can actually afford it, financially and emotionally. She told her story in pieces. The mistakes, the reframe, the rebuild, and they listened. Because she wasn't selling them a dream. She was handing them a mirror. A year passed. Then another. The housing market shifted again. Friends bought homes. Some regretted it. Others didn't. Natalie didn't flinch either way. She wasn't comparing anymore. Her life wasn't a race. It was a rhythm. And she finally learned how to keep time. On the second anniversary of selling the condo, Natalie sat with her journal on a rainy Sunday morning. She opened to a blank page and wrote, what I own now. She paused, then began, my mornings, my decisions, my calendar, my voice, my healing, my finances, my rhythm, my enoughness. She underlined that last one, my enoughness, because that was the true cost of buying too soon, not just the money. It was the way it had once convinced her she wasn't already enough. But now, she was, without the mortgage, without the granite countertops, without the milestone checklist. She was whole, and that was her wealth. Later that week, she met with her financial advisor. They reviewed her progress. Savings, $38,000. Roth IRA, $12,400. Brokerage, $7,100. Emergency fund, fully stocked. Debt, none. But more than the numbers, it was the feeling. Steady, flexible, empowered. And it came not from one good decision, but from dozens of quiet corrections. From years of listening to the gut she had once ignored. From not running from the mistake, but through it. Natalie walked home from the meeting in light rain. No umbrella, just a wool coat and a soft grin. She stopped by the bookstore under her apartment, picked up a new novel, and a little brass tray for her keys. The shopkeeper smiled. "You always look like you just figured something out." Natalie laughed. "Maybe I did." She walked up the stairs, unlocked her door, made tea, and sat in the center of her life. Unburdened, honest, and fully awake. She didn't own property, but she owned the path she was on, and that, she now knew, was real ownership. It was a podcast invitation that brought her story full circle. Natalie had only started listening to Mind Over Money a few months earlier. It was hosted by a financial therapist named Marisol Diaz, an empathetic, grounded woman who spoke in soothing tones and asked better questions than most advisors ever did. Every episode was a story, not just about budgets or debt, but about the emotional anatomy of money. People crying over student loans, laughing about their first paycheck, talking about shame, silence, scarcity. Natalie loved it. So when a random Tuesday inbox ping appeared from the production team, asking if she'd be willing to come on the show for an episode titled, "When Buying a Home Backfires," she froze. She read it 3 times, then closed her laptop. She wasn't ready, not because she hadn't healed, but because telling the story aloud, publicly, meant something more permanent. It meant putting her misstep on the record, naming it, letting others hear it, judge it, learn from it. It meant surrendering the final scraps of shame she'd been hiding in the folds of her otherwise strong, restructured life. She wasn't sure she could do it, but she also knew, if she didn't, someone else like her might fall into the same trap. Thinking buying a home was always the goal. That renting was always defeat. That owning was the end game, instead of just one possible stop along the way. So she messaged the producer back. "Yes, I'm in." The interview was scheduled for a Friday morning. Audio only. Zoom link provided. Natalie made tea, sat cross-legged on her bed, closed the window to block out the bookstore deliveries below. Marisol's voice came through soft and clear. "Welcome, Natalie. I'm so grateful you're here." Natalie smiled, even though no one could see it. "Thank you. I'm a little nervous." "That means you're telling the truth," Marisol said gently. "Let's start wherever feels natural." And so she did. She told them everything. The postcard, the granite countertops, the offer accepted in 6 hours, the surprise utility bills, the AC unit, the sleepless nights, the journal, the spreadsheet titled Exit Strategy. She spoke for over an hour, and it was only when she paused for a breath that she realized her hands were shaking. Not because of fear, because of release. She was no longer protecting the version of herself that had made the mistake. She was honoring the one who had recovered. Marisol was quiet for a moment before responding. "You know," she said softly, "I think there's this cultural myth that the only way to be financially whole is to be a homeowner." Natalie nodded. "But what I hear in your story," Marisol continued, "is someone who made one of the hardest choices anyone can make. You let go of something that no longer aligned, despite everything telling you to hold on." Natalie swallowed. It didn't feel brave at the time. But it was, Marisol said. "You chose alignment over appearance. That's not a small thing." There was silence again, heavy, holy silence. Natalie closed her eyes and smiled. The episode aired 2 weeks later. She told only a few friends about it. No announcement, no post, just the link in a group chat. But it spread, quietly, organically. And then the emails started. A 42-year-old single mom in St. Paul. "I thought I was the only one who regretted buying. Thank you for saying it out loud." A 28-year-old grad student in Denver. "I was about to sign papers next week. After hearing your story, I hit pause. I'm going to run the math again." A recently divorced man in Chicago. "I thought selling the house made me a failure. Now I see it made me free. Natalie sat with each message like they were sacred. Because they were. They weren't just thank yous. They were proof that her pain, her lesson, her story had become someone else's turning point. And that, she realized, was the final cost of freedom. Telling the truth, loud enough to help someone else, even if it costs you your pride. Weeks passed, then months. She was asked to speak at a local financial literacy event, not as an expert, but as a storyteller of financial resilience. She walked on stage in jeans and sneakers. No PowerPoint, no buzzwords, just a chair, a mic, and the weight of her lived experience. She opened with a simple line. I once bought a home I couldn't afford to keep, not because of the money, but because I didn't yet know who I was. The audience went still. Some smiled, some looked down, some held their breath. And for the next 20 minutes, Natalie wove a story, not of loss, but of liberation. She told them how numbers lied when fear drove them, how granite countertops could be gilded cages, how renting wasn't a retreat, it was a reset, how owning didn't always mean freedom, and freedom didn't always require ownership. When she finished, no one clapped right away. They just sat with it, until the quiet broke into the loudest applause she had ever heard. That night, as she walked home through soft streetlight and falling leaves, Natalie thought about all the versions of herself she had lived through. The eager buyer, the ashamed homeowner, the anxious seller, the steady renter, the quiet teacher, and now, the liberated woman, not because she had won, but because she had unlearned it. And in doing so, she had made room for a different kind of wealth, one not measured in square footage, but in truth told, lessons shared, and dignity reclaimed. Later that year, she was invited back on the podcast for a follow-up. What freedom feels like, 1 year later. She accepted. And this time, she didn't hesitate. She spoke with a deeper voice, a slower cadence, a smile in her tone. Freedom, she said, feels like making decisions from clarity, not fear. It feels like paying attention to your numbers and your nervous system. It feels like saying, I don't need to own this home because I own this life. And when the episode ended, Marisol asked one final question. If you could tell your past self anything, what would it be? Natalie smiled. You don't need to prove you're grown. You just need to protect your peace. And that's exactly what she did. Natalie Emerson sat at the back of a small community college classroom, a pen in her hand and a notebook in her lap. But she wasn't a student anymore, not technically. She wasn't here for credit hours or a degree. She was here because of a promise she made to herself 2 years earlier on the floor of a condo she could no longer afford. If I figure this out, I'll help someone else. And now, she was doing exactly that. The course was titled Money Moves, Financial Literacy for First-Gen Adults. It was free to attend, volunteer-led, open seating, mostly women, mostly quiet, some students barely in their 20s, others in their 50s, a few immigrants, a couple of single moms. One woman had a sleeping baby strapped to her chest while she took notes with her free hand. Natalie was one of 3 facilitators that evening. But she wasn't leading the lecture. She was storytelling. I made 6 figures, she said, pacing slowly at the front. Had no kids, no debt, no partner, just me. And I still made a housing decision that cost me over $40,000. Someone in the back raised a hand. Wait, how? You were making good money. Natalie nodded. Yep. And that's part of the myth, right? That income equals immunity. The woman's eyes widened. I thought once I got a decent job, I'd stop worrying. Natalie paused. I thought so too. But the truth is, money isn't just about math. It's about pressure, culture, beliefs, insecurity, status, timing, all the invisible things that mess with how we calculate value. Heads nodded across the room. Another student leaned forward. So how'd you fix it? Natalie smiled, slowly, and by being honest with myself. When the session ended, a few students lingered. One of them, a woman named Shireen, approached her by the whiteboard. I want to buy a house, she said plainly. But I'm scared. Good, Natalie replied. Fear means you're awake. Let's start from there. Shireen laughed nervously. Everyone else in my family is pushing me to buy. They say renting is wasting money. Natalie's face softened. What they mean is, they want you to be safe. But safety doesn't always come from ownership. Sometimes it comes from patience. Shireen's shoulders eased. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you regret buying? Natalie didn't hesitate. I regret buying for the wrong reasons. She said it with no shame, no sting, because it was no longer her secret. It was her offering. That night, she walked home under a sky full of stars, rarely visible in the city, but somehow bright that evening. Her apartment window glowed faintly above the bookstore. Inside, her journal and tea waited. Her cat perched in the window, half asleep. And Natalie? She was building something. Not just a better budget. Not just a smarter plan. A legacy. Not in the grand, generational wealth sense. Not with family trusts or six-figure portfolios. But in the sense of leaving behind clarity. For strangers. For future clients. For younger versions of herself who needed permission to pause, to question, to walk away. She called it financial lineage. And she wanted hers to begin here. Not with wealth hoarded, but wisdom shared. She launched a blog. Unmortgaged. No ads. No affiliate links. Just stories. She wrote about fear-based buying. About emotional debt. About freedom redefined. About what happened when she finally stopped chasing the finish line of homeownership and started building a life that fit. The blog got 400 views the first month. Then 1,200. Then 6,000. Comments poured in. One woman from Atlanta wrote, "You just saved me from making a $300,000 mistake." A recent college grad in Vancouver shared, "I thought I had to buy right after graduation to be taken seriously. I feel so much lighter now." Natalie didn't feel famous. She felt useful, and that was better. She began teaching quarterly workshops with a nonprofit called Renters with Rights. She guest lectured at a local co-working space for female entrepreneurs. She created downloadable templates called Buy versus Rent reflection sheets and homeownership readiness checklists. But she never positioned herself as an expert. She was a narrator, a guide, a person with a bruise that had become a lantern. Her parents didn't quite understand at first. "You're putting your story out there for the world?" her mother asked one Sunday. Natalie nodded. "It's not just my story anymore. It's a pattern." Her father sipped his coffee, thoughtful. "I thought owning a home was the American dream." Natalie looked at him kindly. "For some, maybe. For me, it was a detour to a different dream." He smiled slowly. "You always did make your own map." One evening, she received an email from a high school teacher in Ohio. "We'd love to use your blog post, The Lie of Equity, in our senior econ class. Is that okay?" Natalie teared up. She replied, "Yes, please. If it helps them pause before rushing, it's worth it." And that, to her, was what legacy looked like. Not being known, but being useful. Planting seeds of second thoughts where there had once only been blind steps forward. She kept renting, even as her income rose. Even as friends sent her Zillow links. Even as agents slid into her DMs. She had no shame, because she had already bought the wrong life once. Now she was building the right one, without a down payment. Her investments grew slowly but steadily. She funded a solo 401k. She opened a donor-advised fund for future giving. She created a sinking fund titled, "Yes, I Can Travel," and another called "No, Thank You," for declining gigs she didn't want to take. Each fund became a declaration, a line in her new language of ownership without obligation. Years passed. She was invited to collaborate on a book, a collection of essays by women rethinking wealth. Her chapter title, "The Key I Returned to Myself." And when the book launched, she stood on stage with 6 other women and read her words to an audience of 300 people. There was no shame in her voice. Only strength. Only sovereignty. Only story. Afterward, someone in the audience asked her, "Do you think you'll ever buy again?" Natalie smiled. "I might," she said, "but only if it expands my life, not shrinks it." She paused, looked out at the crowd. "And if I don't, I'll still be free." Because her legacy wasn't about what she owned. It was about what she released, what she reframed, what she redeemed, and that would outlast any deed. The American dream never came with a disclaimer. It didn't mention that home ownership, for all its nostalgic glow, came with fine print written in emotional ink. It didn't say that buying too early, too fast, too performatively could turn that dream into a slow drip nightmare. Natalie Emerson had once believed in the dream. She had pursued it with discipline and spreadsheets and tightly gripped keys. But years later, sitting alone on a public bench in a quiet city park, far from the echo of closing costs and home tours. She realized the American dream she'd been sold was too narrow, too tied to square footage, too silent on context, too loud about status, too quiet about soul. She sipped her coffee, the wind teasing strands of auburn hair from her bun. A squirrel darted past her boots. Behind her, the city hummed with late morning chatter, but inside Natalie's mind, everything was still. She had started redefining her life. Now, she wanted to redefine her country's favorite fantasy. Not to destroy it, to reclaim it. It began with a list. She titled the page her notebook, "The New American Dream, 2025 edition," then drew a line down the center of the paper. On one side, she wrote, "What I was told. Buy a house as soon as you can. More is better. Renters are failing. Appearances matter. Debt is normal. Ownership equals success." And on the other, "What I now know. Timing matters more than tradition. Simplicity creates margin. Renting can be freedom. Transparency is power. Debt is a trap, not a rite of passage. Success is alignment, not applause." She stared at the two columns, then tore the paper in half, and let one side float into the recycling bin, the side she no longer needed. Natalie didn't hate homeownership. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't even anti-buying. She just believed in context now, in nuance, in financial choices rooted in personal reality, not borrowed dreams. And as her platform grew, through the blog, the workshops, the speaking gigs, she started noticing how many others felt the same. People weren't just scared of making a mistake. They were scared of admitting they already had, and even more scared of breaking ranks with their families, their friends, their social circles that whispered, "If you're not owning, you're falling behind." Natalie became the voice that said, "No, you're not. You're just waking up." She hosted her first online seminar that spring. The American Dream, or Your Dream? 200 people signed up. 80 stayed the whole 2 hours. 17 sent messages afterwards saying it changed everything. One woman wrote, "My husband and I were about to sign on a house 45 minutes from work, just because we thought we should. Instead, we're signing a 1-year lease in the neighborhood we love, saving $800 a month, and sleeping better already." Natalie saved that email in a folder titled "Why I Do This," because it wasn't about being right. It was about giving people permission to pause. She began collaborating with other financial educators, not the ones peddling hustle culture and passive income as salvation, but those who spoke with warmth, curiosity, and honesty. One of them, a housing justice advocate named Luis, invited her to co-author a series called Stories from the Gray Zone. It focused on people who lived between the extremes, neither wealthy investors nor destitute renters, just regular folks navigating imperfect decisions with limited information and evolving values. Natalie contributed 2 pieces. "The Condo That Taught Me to Listen. I Sold My House and Bought My Life Back." Each post sparked dozens of replies. Not just comments, confessions, from people who had spent years silently suffering under a mortgage they regretted. From parents who felt like failures for downsizing. From couples who split over house-related stress. From young adults too ashamed to admit they weren't ready to buy. Natalie didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say, "It'll all work out." She said, "Let's talk about how to make the next step better than the last one." And that message, grace plus growth, landed hard and wide. The irony was beautiful. She had lost $40,000 trying to build a life she didn't actually want, and gained a platform and a purpose by telling the truth about it. Her mistake became her message, and her vulnerability became her vehicle, not to become an influencer, but to become a mirror, held up to a culture too scared to question its own expectations. She gave her second TEDx talk that fall. The title, "Maybe You Don't Need to Own That House." She wore a navy jumpsuit and boots she'd owned for 6 years. No slides, just a story. She told the audience how she'd grown up believing home ownership was the prize, how buying had felt like a rival, how it nearly buried her in silence and shame, and how, only after walking away, did she finally come home to herself. She ended with a sentence that made her voice shake. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let go of something that looks perfect but feels wrong." The room stayed quiet for a full 10 seconds before the applause. And for once, she let it wash over her. Not because she needed validation, but because she had earned it by walking through the fire without pretending it was warm. Afterward, a woman in her 60s approached her backstage, tears in her eyes. "You just told my story," she whispered. Natalie touched her hand. "I told our story." Back home, Natalie stood by her bookshelf, thumbing through a copy of The Big Leap by Gay Hendricks. She stopped on a line she'd underlined months earlier. Each of us has an inner thermostat setting that determines how much love, success, and creativity we allow ourselves to enjoy. Natalie whispered aloud, "I just reset mine." And she had. Because legacy wasn't about ownership. It was about awareness. And now, she was rich with it. Her new American dream included autonomy over applause, living where joy lives, not just where price per square foot is ideal, working with values, not just for value, dismantling debt before upgrading the backsplash, saying yes to people, no to pressure, building flexibility into every future plan. And when a friend asked her one night at dinner, "Don't you ever miss the condo?" Natalie smiled. "I don't miss the space," she said. "I miss who I thought I was becoming." She paused, but then I realized I am becoming her, just in a different way. Because the dream was never the house. It was the freedom we believed it would bring. And now, Natalie carried that freedom inside her. No mortgage necessary. There was no lock on the door. No deed. No home equity line attached to the square footage. But it was hers. Natalie Emerson stood in the center of her newly arranged studio apartment, barefoot, a quiet kind of joy stretching across her chest. A thick rug anchored the space. She found it secondhand for $40 and vacuumed it like it was a silk heirloom. A low bookshelf ran along the wall, half novels, half notebooks. In the corner, a desk made of reclaimed pine and scratch brass. On it, her laptop, a glass lamp, and a candle labeled Stillness. Above the desk hung a framed print, the only art she'd bought since selling the condo. It read, "This space was built from clarity, not debt." It had taken her 2 years to feel this still. And now, at 36, she didn't own a square inch of real estate. But for the first time, she truly had a room of her own. The decision to move had been slow. She hadn't been forced to leave her rental above the bookstore. It had served her beautifully, a soft landing after the chaos of selling. But something began to shift in her body. A hunger for intentional solitude. For a space that was quiet not just acoustically, but spiritually. She didn't want more space. She wanted aligned space. She started browsing listings, not for homes to buy, but rooms to rent. Studios, micro-lofts, minimalist nests. She made a list of questions. Does the space make me exhale? Is there natural light? Can I hear my thoughts here? Will this room support who I'm becoming? And then, she found it. A north-facing unit in a converted craftsman house just outside the city center. The walls were sage green. The window looked out over a garden someone else maintained. The kitchen was compact, but smart. And the floor had just enough room for yoga and weeping and dancing and dreaming. She signed a lease 2 days later. No fanfare, just a clean signature. And a whisper to herself, "Make this sacred." On moving day, she brought only 11 boxes. She sold her couch, donated half her clothes, gave her extra cookware to a friend starting over. She wasn't downsizing. She was right-sizing, making space not for things, but for breath. She unpacked slowly, intentionally, one drawer at a time, one ritual at a time. The first night in her new space, she sat cross-legged on the rug with her back against the bed frame. No music, no screens, just a cup of tea and the sound of the wind through the old wooden window frames. She whispered aloud, "Thank you for this." Not to anyone in particular, just to life, to time. To the past self who had surrendered false dreams to build truer ones. She didn't need a backyard anymore. She had an internal garden now. Over the weeks that followed, she built her rhythm. Mondays were her deep work days. Strategy clients in the morning. Writing in the afternoon. Wednesdays, she took long walks after lunch and let herself wander. Fridays, she made soup. Always soup. Something slow and warm and low cost. Saturdays, she lit a candle at 8 a.m. and journaled until her hand hurt. And Sundays were sacred. Not for worship in the traditional sense, but for rest. Radical, unapologetic rest. No planning. No noise. No screen time after 3 p.m. Just books. Hot baths. and quiet reflection in her new sanctuary. Her studio began to reflect who she was, not who she thought she had to be. She didn't decorate to impress. She curated for peace. Everything had intention. A chair that invited reflection. A tiny side table for tea and tarot cards. A string of lights that blinked like lullabies. A diffuser that smelled like cedar and citrus. And perhaps most precious of all, a framed photo of her at 30, taken just a week before she bought the condo. Her smile was bright, her posture proud. But now, Natalie saw something else in that photo. A woman trying so hard to arrive. A woman whose joy was tethered to outside markers. She didn't judge her. She honored her. Because that version of herself had made a brave leap, just not in the right direction. And it was that misstep that paved the way to this stillness. This room. This truth. She began inviting people in, carefully, not many, just the right ones. People who wouldn't comment on the size of her fridge, who wouldn't say, "You could totally buy again with your income." People who knew how to speak gently around dreams. One night, her friend Leah visited from Portland. They sat on the floor, barefoot, sipping mulled wine from chipped mugs. "This is cozy," Leah said, looking around. "It's a nest," Natalie replied. Leah smiled. "You look happy." "I'm not always," Natalie admitted. "But I'm always aligned." And that, she decided, was the better target. She created a shelf labeled, "Things That Matter." On it, her grandmother's journal. A printed copy of her TEDx script. The envelope that once held the check from the condo sale. A handwritten note from a workshop attendee. "You helped me listen to myself." She didn't need trophies. She had testimonies. And they reminded her. She wasn't here to conquer the world. She was here to connect to it. One budget, one boundary, one story at a time. Sometimes she still wondered, would she ever own again? And the answer was honest. Maybe, but not out of panic. Not to prove adulthood. Not to buy someone else's timeline. If she bought, it would be as a garden, not a cage. A platform, not a performance. She'd walk through the front door of that future home with quiet feet and a full heart. Not to arrive, but to expand. Until then, she had everything she needed. In one room. In one life. In one unshakable truth. She was already whole. She had returned to herself. And this time, she wasn't leaving. The course started with a post-it note. Natalie Emerson had been teaching casually, workshops at the local nonprofit, guest panels, podcast interviews. But she kept getting the same questions after every session. How do I actually begin? Where should I start if I'm overwhelmed? Can you help me figure out what financial freedom means for me? And after one particularly moving event, she walked home, poured a cup of ginger tea, and wrote the words that had been circling her mind for weeks. "You're not bad with money. You're just using someone else's map." She stuck the note above her desk, and beneath it, she sketched out a new idea. Not just another budgeting class. Not a personal finance boot camp. Something gentler. Something rooted in clarity, compassion, and agency. She didn't want to teach people how to crush their debt or retire early. She wanted to teach people how to listen to themselves again. Because sometimes the most radical financial act wasn't optimization. It was alignment. She called it the Real Wealth Project. A 6-week journey into personal finance with heart. No apps. No spreadsheets on day one. No shame. Just stories. Frameworks. Questions. A container where people could ask, what do I really want my money to do for me, without flinching? She mapped out 6 modules. Unlearning the money myths. Listening to your financial nervous system. Spending as self-expression. Saving for power, not panic. Debt, boundaries, and emotional contracts. Designing a financial life that fits. Each module opened with a story, usually one of her own. Like how she ignored the voice in her gut during the open house. How she lied to herself about being fine for 8 months. How she created a spreadsheet called Exit Strategy at 3 a.m. She didn't hide her missteps. She framed them. Because what she wanted people to know was this. Financial mistakes are not a sign of failure. They are the birthplace of deeper knowing. She launched a pilot version with 12 students. They met every Sunday night on Zoom. Cameras on, notebooks open. Some were parents. Some were recent grads. Some were tired of pretending they had it together. And on the first night, Natalie didn't show them a budget. She showed them her condo journal. The same spiral-bound notebook she used to write. Was this really costing me? The students leaned forward. Because this wasn't theory. This was life. They listened. Then one by one, they shared their own stories. A woman who secretly used her emergency fund to pay her brother's legal fees. A man who hadn't opened his credit card statement in 6 months. A single mom who hadn't bought new shoes in a year because she was saving for a down payment she wasn't even sure she wanted. There were tears, laughter, silence. But most of all, there was relief. Because for the first time, these stories had a home. And they weren't being judged. They were being heard. By week 3, something shifted. Natalie gave an assignment. Document 3 spending choices that reflect your actual values. Not what looked good on paper. Not what Dave Ramsey would approve of. Choices that made them feel like themselves. The next session, they reported back. One woman bought a museum membership because beauty made her feel alive. Another spent $45 on a babysitter just to read a book uninterrupted at a cafe. A man said no to a guy's trip to Vegas, and yes to finally repairing his old guitar. Natalie beamed. This, she said, is what I mean by real wealth. In week 4, she shared her template, the enoughness budget. It wasn't built on percentages. It was built on piece points. Each category, housing, food, fun, growth, had a simple question. At what level does this category begin to nourish you? And where does it start to suffocate you? One student, Carla, stared at the screen and whispered, "No one's ever asked me that." "Ask it now," Natalie said, "and give yourself permission to answer." Carla exhaled and wrote. By the final week, Natalie had stopped being the teacher. She was now the facilitator of a room full of quiet revolutions. People weren't just spending differently. They were thinking differently. One student said, "I used to think financial freedom was a number. Now I think it's a feeling." Another added, "I didn't need another side hustle. I needed a side of myself I hadn't listened to." Natalie wrote both quotes in her journal. Because this was it. This was her calling. Not just to help people survive money, but to rewrite their relationship with it. From domination to dialogue. From control to co-creation. After the pilot, she expanded. Turned the course into a digital workbook. Added audio guides. Built a private online community. But she kept the tone intimate. She refused to scale into sterility. Each cohort was capped at 20 people. Each story was protected. Because Natalie knew, transformation can't be rushed, and trust can't be mass-produced. One night, after a cohort graduation, she sat at her desk with a candle flickering beside her laptop. She read through the exit survey answers. One question had been, "What was the most valuable thing you learned?" And someone had answered, "That I'm not broken. That I'm allowed to want a financial life that feels like me. And that the mistake I made wasn't fatal. It was just my starting line." Natalie stared at the screen, eyes soft, spine straight. Because that was her legacy. Not in a house she no longer owned. Not in an account balance. But in moments like this, where someone, somewhere, reclaimed their agency because Natalie had once lost hers. She closed her laptop, picked up her journal, and wrote, "What I teach now is not how to win at money. It's how to come home to yourself in the process of earning, spending, saving, and surrendering." She looked up, out the window, into the soft city night, and felt more rooted than she ever had. No mortgage, no map, just a mission, to help people build lives that fit the shape of their soul, not just the mold of the system. And in doing so, she had found her true wealth. And finally, her true home. She didn't plan to meet anyone. Not because she was closed off. Not because she believed love was over. It just wasn't on the list. Natalie Emerson's life was full in quiet, intentional ways. Her days had rhythm. Her nights had calm. Her studio apartment, her room of her own, held her with the kind of peace she had spent years chasing. She was no longer busy performing. She was no longer obsessed with catching up. And more importantly, she was no longer waiting for someone to complete her. She had already done that part herself. So when she met Elias, it was not a grand romantic entrance. It was a coffee spill. It was a chilly Sunday morning in October. Natalie had gone to the bookstore cafe around the corner to write. A rare outing these days. Most of her work happened in her studio, but the crispness in the air had pulled her out of bed. She carried her coffee to the nearest table, notebook in one hand, wool scarf knotted around her neck. Just as she set the mug down, someone backed into her with a to-go tray. The impact was gentle, but the result wasn't. The lid popped off. Coffee splashed on her hand. Her her sleeve, and the corner of her notebook. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," said a voice. Natalie looked up. He was tall, in a quiet sort of way. Messy dark curls, glasses, hoodie, a reusable cup in one hand, and panic in his eyes. "It's fine," Natalie said, instinctively grabbing a napkin. "It's okay." "No, really, I should have watched where I was going." "It's just coffee," she interrupted, smiling. "If this is the worst part of my day, I'm doing pretty well." He laughed, finally. "Can I buy you another?" She glanced at her cup, still mostly full, steaming in place. She considered her notebook, the bottom corner now warped with warmth. Then she looked back at him. "You know what?" she said. "Sure, but only if you let me buy you one too. For balance." He grinned. "Deal." His name was Elias Vega, graphic designer, divorced, 2 plants, a motorcycle he rarely rode, and the most grounded energy she'd ever felt in another human being. They sat at the table after their mutual coffees were replaced, chatting like old friends. She didn't tell him everything, just that she was a writer, mostly finance stuff, but more emotional money than Wall Street. He didn't tell her everything either, just that he freelanced, was rebuilding after a rough breakup, and had recently started therapy. She didn't ask for more, and he didn't demand details. They just talked, and when he asked, "Do you want to keep this conversation going sometime?" she found herself saying yes. Not from pressure, not from longing, but from curiosity. They met again the next weekend. Same cafe, different energy. This time, she let herself soften a little, told him about the workshops, about the condo. Not the full story, not yet, but the shape of it. Elias listened like someone who wasn't waiting to talk. He nodded slowly, like he understood before he replied. "I rented out my old apartment for a while after the divorce," he said. "I kept telling myself I'd move back into it someday. But the truth was, it didn't fit anymore. Not the space. Not the version of me who lived there." Natalie's breath caught for a second, because she knew that feeling intimately. The dissonance of who you were versus who you had outgrown. And sitting across from Elias, sipping from a chipped ceramic mug, she felt the edges of herself relax. Maybe she didn't need to protect her peace so hard anymore. Maybe she could share it. Still, she moved carefully. She had boundaries now, not walls, but gently gated paths. They saw each other on weekends, texted throughout the week. Some calls, occasional deep dives. She didn't introduce him to everyone right away. Didn't let him stay over on impulse. Didn't apologize for needing space. And to her quiet surprise, he didn't flinch. When she needed a night alone, he said, "I'll be here when you want to reconnect." When she mentioned her budgeting rituals, he asked to learn. When she told him about her TEDx talk, he watched it twice. And on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, 3 months into knowing him, he handed her a small notebook with a red ribbon. "I wrote something," he said, voice lower than usual. "Just thoughts about how I grew up with money. You don't have to read it now." She opened it that night on her couch, tea in hand, rain tapping the windows. Page 1. Things I was taught about money, that I'm learning to question. She read all 20 pages. By the end, she was crying, because no one had ever mirrored her vulnerability quite like that. It wasn't romantic in the way movies framed love. It was safe, and Natalie realized. She wasn't waiting for fireworks. She was waiting for resonance. And now she had it. Elias didn't move in. They didn't talk about marriage. There was no rush. Just respect. He stayed over some weekends, cooked with her on Thursdays, built her a custom shelf for her things that matter corner. She helped him edit his client proposals and showed him how to track expenses in a way that didn't make him spiral. They existed in slow orbit. No merging. No ownership. Just 2 whole people choosing to meet in the middle. One night, curled on the rug after watching a documentary, he asked her, "Do you think you'll ever own again? A place, I mean." She thought for a moment. "Maybe," she said, "if it feels like growth, not gravity." He nodded. "That makes sense. You?" "Same," he replied. "I think we all just want a home. We just define it differently." She smiled. "And I think the first one we have to own is ourselves." He kissed her gently then. No music, no spotlight, just skin on skin, heart on heart. And for the first time in a very long time, Natalie didn't feel like she was giving something up to be close to someone. She felt like she was expanding. Later that night, lying next to him, wide awake but soft in her body, Natalie stared at the ceiling and whispered inward. This is what love feels like when it's not tied to urgency or roles or rescue. It was built on presence, on permission, on patience. And for a woman who had once traded her truth for a title, this love was the real estate she never saw coming. She didn't own him, and he didn't own her, but they both belonged to themselves, to the moment, to a future neither needed to fast-track. Because the kind of freedom Natalie had built for herself, financial, emotional, spiritual, wasn't something you share lightly. It had to be earned, and Elias had earned it not with grand gestures, but with quiet understanding, the kind that says, I see your sovereignty, and I want to stand beside it, not in front of it. So when people asked, are you seeing anyone? Natalie would smile and say, yes, someone who makes room for the truth. And when they asked, are you happy? She'd reply, no, I'm whole. Happiness is a mood. This is something deeper. And she meant it, every word. Because the real love story wasn't about meeting someone. It was about meeting herself fully first, then letting someone meet her there. No mortgage, no mask, no myth. Just this. A woman who had once overextended for a dream, now living one she built by hand, and letting love grow within it. Like sunlight through a window, she opened all on her own. There were some things Natalie Emerson had said out loud. In workshops, in interviews, in whispered conversations with women carrying stories that mirrored hers. There were things she'd written, blog posts, newsletters, even her TEDx talk. But there were other things she hadn't quite found the language for. Things that lived deeper, underneath the healed-over places, under the spreadsheets and strategy and stillness. And one day, as the rain came down in soft vertical lines outside her window, she sat at her desk with a blank page and a pen. No laptop, no formatting, no audience, just a quiet invitation to write to the girl who started all of this, the girl who signed those papers, the girl who mistook pressure for clarity, the girl who had no idea that she was about to lose $40,000 and gain herself. Natalie wrote, at first without pause, without perfect grammar or structure, just truth, just softness, just the voice she wished someone had offered her back then. Dear 30-year-old me, you're sitting at a kitchen island you don't own yet. The granite is cool under your palms, and you feel powerful. You think this is the moment your life finally becomes adult. You're half right. You are crossing a threshold, but not into adulthood, into awakening. It won't feel like that at first. It will feel like drowning. You'll sign the mortgage paperwork and smile for your realtor's photo, and for a little while, you'll convince yourself you made it. But soon, quietly at first, you'll notice a pressure, an ache in your chest that tightens when the bills arrive, a whisper in your head that questions every target run, a small voice that asks, what have I done? And an even smaller one that replies, don't say that out loud. I wish I could walk into that room and wrap my arms around you, not to stop you from signing, not to snatch the pen from your hand, but just to say, you are not broken if this doesn't turn out the way you hoped. You'll wake up in that condo 6 months later and feel the kind of exhaustion money can't fix. You'll run numbers at 2 a.m. You'll cry on the floor next to your dishwasher. You'll Google, should I sell my house after 1 year, and feel shame crawl across your skin. But I need you to hear this. You didn't fail. You followed a script that was never written for your spirit. And when you finally find the courage to write your own script, it will change everything. You'll sell the condo. Not a loss. Not exactly. But not a gain either. You'll walk away with less money and more clarity. You'll move into a smaller place. You'll say no to a lifestyle that doesn't nourish you. And for a while, you'll live with the ghost of a mistake you think defines you. It doesn't. I promise. It will become the soil. From it will grow a life that is rich, not in possessions, but in presence. You'll build a course that changes people's lives. You'll teach women how to spend with intention, how to speak their enoughness out loud. You'll fall in love with someone who sees you clearly and never tries to rearrange your rhythm. You'll look in the mirror and finally recognize the woman you wanted to be at 30. And here's the wildest part. She didn't come from buying a condo. She came from letting it go. I know you don't believe me yet. I know right now, you're clinging to the myth that says success means square footage. But soon, you'll rewrite that myth. You'll learn that space doesn't equal freedom. Clarity does. And clarity isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It shows up in your gut, in your body, in the way you exhale when you stop trying to impress anyone and start living for you. So here's what I want to leave you with. Not advice, not strategy, just a blessing. May you forgive yourself quickly. May you listen when your body says, not yet. May you trust that exiting isn't failure, it's wisdom in motion. And may you remember, you're not a number. You're not a net worth. You're not a property line. You are not the mistake. You are the person who survived it. And that makes you holy. I'll see you soon. And when I do, I'll thank you. Because you walked through fire. So I could sit here now in the quiet and write this letter. With peace. With pride. And with love. Always. Natalie. She set the pen down. Exhaled. Her hands trembled. Not from fear, but from release. Writing that letter felt like placing the final stone in a garden wall she'd spent 6 years building. A wall not meant to keep people out, but to protect what grew inside. Resilience. Grace. Wisdom. And now, forgiveness. She didn't mail it. She folded the letter and slipped it into the back of her old condo journal. The same one with her 3 a.m. calculations. The same one where she wrote, "What is this really costing me?" The same one she almost threw away, but now kept as sacred text. Because that letter wasn't meant to be sent. It was meant to set her free. From shame. From the narrative that said you must always get it right the first time. From the idea that financial mistakes were signs of weakness, instead of invitations to listen more closely. That evening, she lit a candle. Not for ritual, but for gratitude. The flame danced quietly on the windowsill as she whispered, "You did good, girl. You did hard things. You kept going." And in the stillness that followed, Natalie Emerson, the once scared spreadsheet-clutching woman who thought a condo was the key to her worth, finally knew. She hadn't bought her freedom. She had rewritten it, line by line, lesson by lesson, light by light. And that was the most valuable asset she would ever hold. There was no announcement. No, I hit 6 figures. Instagram post. No fireworks. Just an early morning in February. Soft snow dusting the window pane, and Natalie Emerson sitting on the floor with her laptop and tea, logging into her Vanguard account. The number blinked back at her. $100,024.31. For a long moment, she didn't react. She didn't gasp. Didn't leap up. She just stared. It was the first time in her life she'd seen that number on her own. No inheritance. No real estate. No external jumpstart. Just her. Her budget. Her boundaries. Her breath work, her choices. Every dollar on that screen was a breadcrumb on the trail of the woman she'd become. And sitting there on her thrifted rug, knees hugged to her chest, she whispered to herself, quiet wealth, not just in numbers, in knowing that her life was hers now, that she could say no with ease, yes with discernment, and choose every single day to live in alignment with the kind of wealth no one could see, but she could feel. Her definition of wealth had shifted over the years. It used to be about freedom from work. Then it became about safety. Then dignity. Then choice. Now, wealth was space. To rest. To wait. To move without explaining herself. To build slow things. Not businesses that scaled overnight. Not brand deals or viral growth. But steady, sustainable foundations. A net beneath her life, woven stitch by stitch. She updated her financial roadmap that same day, not because she needed a new goal, but because she wanted new clarity. Her updated dashboard included emergency fund, $18,000, 6 months of calm, Roth IRA, $21,300, slow and sacred, solo 401k, $39,000, her future self's pension, brokerage, $12,100, flex fund, giving account, $2,400, aligned generosity. Fund, $2,700, because joy is a necessity, not a luxury. Renter's safety net fund, for $1,524, inspired by our students, enough to cover a deposit, first month, and movers. Each line wasn't just money. It was peace purchased in pieces. The world might never know her name, but she was rich where it counted. She didn't share the screenshot. She didn't post a milestone reel. She made soup, lentil and lemon, thick with turmeric and warmth. She lit a candle, opened her journal, and wrote, "I'm not rich. I'm rooted, and that's enough." The money itself didn't change her, but it changed the volume in her life. The noise that used to scream, "You're behind. You're failing. You need to buy," was now a whisper she could ignore. In its place, a growing quiet, a steady hum, the sound of sovereignty. With the pressure gone, her attention turned outward, not in performance, in participation. She began exploring value-aligned investing, low-fee ESG index funds, community lending circles, crowdfunding platforms for women-led startups. She set a goal. Let 15% of what I build uplift others. Not charity in a performative sense, but strategic, quiet redistribution. Not for applause, for integrity. She made her first Kiva loan to a woman in Bolivia expanding her village's grocery stand, then another to a farmer in Kenya buying sustainable tools. It wasn't much. $100 here, $250 there. But every time she clicked send, it reminded her, wealth is not what we keep. It's what we release with intention. She also began mentoring in new ways. One of her Real Wealth Project graduates, a single mom named Carmen, was starting a bookkeeping side hustle. Natalie offered her 3 months of paid admin work. "I know it's not much," she said in the email, "but I believe in you." Carmen replied, "You just bought me time. That's worth more than anything." Natalie cried reading that, because she understood that kind of time, the kind you don't have when your money is too loud to think. And now, she could offer what she once needed. Margin. Elias noticed the shift. "You've been glowing lately," he said one night as they brushed teeth side by side. She spat into the sink, smiled. "I think it's the internal compound interest." He laughed, but she was serious. Because every quiet decision she'd made, every time she didn't spend every time she saved without scarcity, had stacked into sovereignty, into ease. One weekend, Natalie printed out her net worth report and put it in a folder labeled Life Evidence. Not to measure her value, to honor her process. She slipped a note in the front. "This is what happens when you unhook your worth from a mortgage and anchor in truth." She used to think wealth would feel like power. It didn't. It felt like softness. Like buying groceries without checking her account first. Funding her annual Lisbon trip in cash. Giving $500 to a friend without hesitation. Turning down a lucrative brand deal because it clashed with her values. Sleeping through the night without dead dreams. And most of all, it felt like walking through the world at her own pace. She still rented. By choice. She knew she could buy again now. But the rush was gone. Ownership no longer felt like salvation. It felt like one many tools. She would use it when it made sense. But she would never again use it to prove her worth. Instead, she built a life with multiple exit doors. A business that didn't need to scale. Savings that could carry her 6 months if she burned out. A community that cared more about her rest than her output. A partner who didn't flinch when she said, "I need a week off." That, to her, was the most valuable thing. Mobility. To pivot. To pause. To say, "This isn't working anymore," and mean it. Quiet wealth wasn't loud. It didn't scream freedom from the rooftops. It didn't wear designer shoes or drive Teslas. It looked like a well-stocked pantry. An uncluttered inbox. A slow Tuesday afternoon with space to breathe. It was a freezer full of soup. A therapist on speed dial. A calendar with white space. And Natalie had all of that now. Not by accident. By devotion. She used to think she had to climb a ladder. Now she built a web. Strong. Flexible. Resilient. And when storms came, and they did, she didn't collapse. She flexed. Because her wealth wasn't one fragile structure. It was a network of care she'd spent years weaving. For herself. For others. For the woman she'd once been, crouched on a bathroom floor wondering if she'd ever breathe again. She had. She was. And she would keep building, not toward a peak, but outward, into a life that held her, that fed others, that didn't need to be big to be enough. Just honest. Just durable. Just quietly free. The word legacy used to scare Natalie Emerson. Not because she feared death, but because, for a long time, she believed legacy had to look a certain way. Children. Heirs. A last name carried forward. A house passed down like a treasured artifact. Something concrete. Traditional. Traceable. But at 38, child-free by choice, still a renter, still without a deed to her name, Natalie had begun to understand. Legacy isn't what you leave. It's what you seed. And not all seeds need a surname. Some bloom in strangers, in whispers, in notebooks, in unspoken moments where someone remembers something you said and chooses differently because of it. That, she realized, was her life's work. Not to accumulate, but to activate. Not to hand down property, but to pass on perspective. It started with a question from a workshop student named Jada. They were in the middle of a real wealth project session when Jada asked, "What happens if we don't have kids? Who do we build for then?" The group went silent. Natalie felt it ripple across the room. She didn't rush to answer. Instead, she let the question breathe. Then she said, "We build for the ones we'll never meet." She thought about that sentence for weeks after. What does it mean to leave behind something that doesn't live in a family tree? She pulled out her journal and wrote a different kind of legacy plan. No estate attorney. No trust fund. Just intention. Natalie Emerson's legacy, without a last name. Publish stories that help people forgive themselves faster. Fund one scholarship a year for a woman of color in financial education. Mentor 10 women into leadership roles by the time she's 50. Create a digital library of free tools for renters, under her own name, but free of copyright. Record an audio diary of her most valuable money lessons for anyone who needs them. Leave 10 letters behind, written to strangers she'll never meet. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't trend, but it felt real. It felt enough. And more than that, it felt freeing. Because now she was no longer trying to build a future through lineage. She was building a ripple, and that changed everything. One day, while decluttering, she found a box of her old real estate paperwork. Appraisals, mortgage contracts, title insurance. It was all still there, dusty, yellowed, like the bones of a life she no longer inhabited. She pulled out the original purchase contract, held it in her hands, and smiled, not with bitterness, but with gratitude. That mistake, that was where her legacy began, because it forced her to question, to unlearn, to surrender the version of success she was told she needed. And in that surrender, she had made space for new definitions, new truths, new freedom. She fed the papers in her shredder, one page at a time, and whispered after each, "Thank you." Because even the missteps had built something now, something you couldn't list on Zillow, but could feel in your bones. Natalie started working on her legacy toolkit soon after, a free online resource for people who didn't want to follow the traditional roadmaps of success, but still wanted their lives to mean something. It had reflection prompts, journaling guides, voice memo templates. Questions like, who did you become because of your mistakes? What does it mean to be useful in this season? What do you hope someone will learn from your journey? What part of you will survive beyond your bank account? She called it legacy in the margins. It wasn't viral. It was vital. A collection of echoes, left like breadcrumbs for anyone else walking through financial fog, wondering if their life would ever add up to something. Natalie gave it away for free, not because it had no value, but because she believed that some legacies aren't owned. They're shared. One afternoon, she got an email from a woman in Winnipeg. Subject line, "You don't know me, but you changed my life." The body read, "I found your audio journal while searching for money advice that didn't make me feel ashamed. I listened to it on a night when I was sitting in my car, crying over an eviction notice. And something you said, financial mistakes are not the end of your story, they're the beginning of your awareness, made me breathe again. I'm still struggling, but I'm budgeting now, and I moved in with a friend, and I'm starting over. Just wanted you to know, your words mattered." Natalie closed her eyes after reading it, and felt the unmistakable tug of impact. No book deal, no monument, just one woman, in a car, breathing a little easier because Natalie once sat in a room she couldn't afford and chose not to lie about it. That, she thought, is enough. Sometimes, people asked if she regretted not building traditional wealth. "You don't want to leave something behind?" they'd ask. She'd smile. "I already am." Every time someone stops comparing. Every time someone budgets with self-trust. Every time someone rents with pride instead of shame. I've left something behind. Because the truest inheritance is courage. And she'd passed that down hundreds of times now. No children, no family crest, but a forest of ripple effects, rooted in truth. She once read a quote, "Legacy is planting seeds in a garden you never get to see bloom." She had lived that. And as she approached her 40th birthday, she decided to celebrate it not with a party, but with a private ceremony. Just her journal, a match, and 10 envelopes. Each one held a letter titled, "To the one who needs this." Letters to a teacher, a single parent, a first-gen college grad, a woman rebuilding after financial abuse, a man letting go of a dream that no longer fits. She left the return address blank, dropped them at different libraries, cafes, and laundromats across the city. A secret legacy, one she would never trace. But that's the thing about real legacy. It isn't transactional. It's transformational. And it doesn't always come back to you. Because it was never meant to. Years ago, Natalie believed she needed a house to prove she mattered. Now, she didn't even need her name attached to the chain she created. She had let go of the deed and claimed something far more enduring. The ability to shape lives without needing to be remembered. Because love doesn't need a title. And legacy doesn't need a will. Sometimes all it takes is telling the truth loud enough that someone hears it and lives differently because of it. That, she decided, was enough. And it always would be. There was a time when Natalie Emerson believed freedom meant leaving. Leaving her job. Leaving her city. Leaving the box someone else had drawn around her idea of adulthood. She dreamed of open roads. Backpacking through Portugal. Long train rides with journals on her lap and no return ticket. But as her 40th birthday approached, she stood barefoot in the center of her rented studio apartment, plants swaying gently from the window breeze, and realized freedom, for her, had shifted. It wasn't about movement anymore. It was about optional movement, the ability to go, or stay, without panic, without pressure, without pretending. That was the new definition, because staying by choice, that was the boldest freedom of all. She first felt it one Thursday afternoon while walking past an open house on her street. The sign said, "Charming one-bedroom bungalow, $679,000. 3 years ago, she would have paused, walked in, collected the flyer, run the numbers in her head, started to imagine a life that might not fit. But now, she smiled and kept walking, not because she couldn't afford it, but because she didn't need to chase what no longer tempted her. She had built a life that no longer hinged on external upgrades. Her joy lived inside her, not at a closing table. Her friends noticed. "You seem light," one of them said over brunch. "I feel unpressured," Natalie replied. "Are you thinking of buying again?" Natalie stirred her tea. "Maybe, if the math, the emotion, and the timing align." Her friend laughed. "That's the most you answer ever." And it was. Because she didn't speak in absolutes anymore. She spoke in readiness. Not never. Not always. Just when it's right. That was what freedom sounded like now. She decided to test it, to check if her freedom was real, or just routine in disguise. She picked a weekend in April and booked a tiny Airbnb in a coastal town 300 miles north. A solo trip. Just her, a rented bike, and her journals. She didn't plan an itinerary. Didn't overthink the packing. She just left. 2 hours into the drive, music low, wind teasing her curls through the open window, she grinned to herself. Because she hadn't asked for permission, hadn't calculated if she could afford the time, hadn't wondered if she'd fall behind. She just went. That, she realized, was the difference between a life built on pressure and one built on choice. The cottage was small, sunlit, with uneven floors and a record player. She wrote at dawn, walked through Tittapools at noon, and read until midnight. She cooked pasta and cried watching old movies. She didn't find herself. She simply sat with herself, unrushed, unbranded, unrequired to explain her existence. It was the kind of peace she used to think she needed to escape to find. Now she realized she had brought it with her. Because freedom wasn't a location. It was an internal posture. When she returned home, everything looked the same, but everything felt different. Not because the trip changed her, because it confirmed something she'd already started to believe. Freedom isn't about what you do. It's about knowing you have a say in how you do it. She reviewed her money plan again. Her freedom sheet, she called it. Not a budget, not a fire tracker, just a list of what mobility looked like in every season. Financial freedom meant 6 months of expenses saved, enough work flexibility to take a break at any time, knowing her monthly costs down to the dollar, having no consumer debt, investing steadily, not aggressively, saying no without financial consequence, and, most importantly, feeling no resentment toward the life she chose. And right now, every line was in alignment. She didn't feel stuck. She felt centered. Still, she wanted to check herself, to explore what go really looked like. So she made a list. What I need to feel safe moving tomorrow. No lease entanglements. Digital, location flexible work. Support network by phone. Portable insurance. Emergency fund and a high-yield savings account. Clarity on where home will be next. Then she made another. What I need to stay joyfully. Emotional roots, not guilt. Living space that feels aligned. Work that feeds me. Time for creativity. A few beloved places I can walk to. A community I contribute to. Both lists were complete. Both lists were true. She could leave. She could stay. And both would be wins. That, she thought, is the realest wealth of all. She shared this framework at her next seminar, titled Optionality, the Missing Piece in Financial Literacy. She stood in front of 30 adult learners, ranging from a 23-year-old barista to a 58-year-old recently divorced father, and asked them, what would it mean if your life didn't depend on choosing the right path, but on knowing you can pivot anytime? Hands went up. Conversations flowed. One man said, I always thought financial freedom meant quitting my job, but now I think it means not fearing if I had to. A woman added, I don't want to move. I just want to know I can if I need to. Natalie beamed. That was it. Freedom wasn't exit. Freedom was breathing room. She started calling it radical stability, not rooted in rigidity, rooted in choice. Like renting a place you love, not because you can't own, but because it keeps you light. Saving, not to flee, but to feel ready. Working for yourself, not to hustle, but to have capacity. Taking trips, not to prove you've escaped, but to remember you're alive. Staying in one place, not out of fear, but because you know the door is open anytime. Freedom, she decided, is not measured by miles. It's measured by permission. The permission to listen inward, every month, every season, and ask, is this still working for me? And if the answer was no, she could pivot, not burn it down, just adjust. That was the beauty of building a life with slack, with cushion, with clarity. You didn't have to perform bravery. You just had to plan gently enough that change wasn't a crisis. One day, Elias asked her over dinner, would you ever want to live abroad? She thought for a moment. Maybe, but not to prove I'm adventurous. Only if it adds to the quiet I've built here. He nodded. That makes sense. I think freedom used to mean extremes, she added. Now I think it means soft exit doors. From anything, even things I love, just in case I stop loving them. He raised his glass. To soft exits. She clinked hers. To peaceful entrances. And in that moment, Natalie Emerson, once panicked in a too expensive condo, once obsessed with homeownership as identity, smiled. Because she was no longer tied to a structure, or a script, or even a destination. She was simply in rhythm. With herself. With time. With a version of life that could always shift, always grow, and always make room for both movement and stillness. And that was the only address she needed now. It had been nearly a decade since she signed those papers. The condo, the so-called dream, the $200,000 mistake. And now, as Natalie Emerson sat on her front steps, rented steps, lovingly swept clean that morning, she smiled. Not the kind of smile that announces triumph. Not the kind that says, I proved them all wrong. Just the quiet, grounded kind that comes from knowing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. She wasn't rich in the traditional sense. She didn't own a home. She hadn't maxed out every investment account. She wasn't featured on Forbes. But she had something rarer. Peace. And she had built it from scratch. That spring, she had moved again. Not out of urgency. Not to run. But to align. The studio had served her through healing. But she'd outgrown it. She wanted light. A garden. More room to write. And a sense of arrival. But not the kind she'd once chased. This time, it was about congruence. So she found a small rental cottage in the outer city, a 1920s brick guest house behind an older couple's home. 2 rooms, an herb garden, hardwood floors that creaked under honest living. The lease was month to month, and yet it felt like home, because it didn't bind her. It matched her. Her first morning there, she made pancakes barefoot on the gas stove, the sun streaming through lace curtains. She ate on the back porch, knees pulled to her chest, journal open beside her. And she wrote, home is not where the mortgage is. It's where my breath slows. where my bank account doesn't determine my belonging, where I don't have to arrive, because I already have. She called this place her final home, not because she would die here, but because it was the first home that required no pretending. She didn't decorate for Pinterest. She decorated for presence. A second-hand armchair under a reading lamp, a windowsill of basil and rosemary, a writing desk built from reclaimed wood, a candle in every room, even the bathroom. The walls weren't showroom white. They were the kind of warm beige that held secrets and stillness equally. And on one wall, framed simply, was the first page of her old exit strategy spreadsheet. Not to relive the pain, to honor the moment she chose herself. That, to her, was sacred. In the evenings, she took long walks around the neighborhood. No headphones, just footsteps and thoughts. She passed new builds with smart doorbells and manicured driveways. She passed aging duplexes with cracked planters and laughter spilling from open windows. And every time, she felt no envy, no ache, because she had unhooked her worth from comparison. She was no longer climbing a ladder. She was cultivating roots. Elias still visited every weekend. They remained separate but intertwined, two orbits, gently overlapping. They cooked together, gardened together, held each other in silence when words were too heavy. But there was no rush, no pressure to merge lives or bank accounts, no need to tie love to logistics, because both of them understood now. The most stable relationships are built not on need, but on wholeness. They had chosen each other, and kept choosing, without condition. One Sunday afternoon, Elias watched her water the lavender bed. "You know," he said, "you're the only person I've ever met who made peace into a plan." Natalie laughed. "You can budget for anything with enough clarity." "But how did you know what you needed?" he asked. She paused. "I didn't at first," she said. "But I knew what I didn't want anymore. Panic, pretending, proving. And once I stopped building for appearances, what I needed became obvious." He nodded, and she added, more to herself than to him, "You can't hear your true wants when you're drowning in other people's expectations." That fall, she taught her last cohort of the Real Wealth Project. Not because she was quitting, but because it was time to evolve. The course had reached over 2,000 students by then, each of them a ripple, each of them a living legacy. And now, she wanted to focus on depth. One-on-one mentorships, retreats, write her first book, not to expand her platform, to deepen her roots. Because home, she realized, wasn't just a place. It was a practice, a rhythm, a ritual, a return to self, again and again. She called the book, "The Life You Can Afford to Love." Subtitle, "Reclaiming Freedom from Financial Perfection." It was part memoir, part guidebook, and fully hers. She didn't write it to be famous. She wrote it to make sure no one else had to cry alone on the floor of a condo they couldn't afford. To offer breadcrumbs for anyone trapped in the myth of should. To remind people that money is not a verdict. It's a mirror. And when you clean the fog off, what you see should look like you. Not your parents. Not your boss. Not Instagram. You. She launched the book quietly. A small gathering in the backyard. Tea. Music. No stage. She read one passage aloud. The part about selling the condo, about the shame and silence and spreadsheet she titled Life Reimagined. And when she finished, no one clapped. They just sat with it, like they'd been handed permission to rewrite something in their own lives. And that, she knew, was the best applause. Later that night, alone under the fairy lights, she journaled. "This is my final home, not because it will never change, but because it finally reflects what I've built. Enoughness, flexibility, peace that doesn't demand possession, a life I can stay in, a life I can leave, a life I am not owned by." She didn't cry. She just closed the journal and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." To her past self, to her scared self, to the self that kept going. Because this humble, radiant, gentle life was the return on that investment. There were still hard days, still bills, still uncertainty, still global chaos and aging parents and restless nights. But the difference now, she had margin, not just in her bank account, in her mind, in her calendar, in her body. And that margin made her resilient. She didn't need to feel safe every second. She just needed to feel steady enough to bend. And she was. One morning, a student from her first ever cohort emailed, "I finally feel like my money is a dialogue, not a dictator. You taught me that. Thank you." Natalie smiled. That was it. Her final home wasn't this house. It wasn't a structure at all. It was the life she'd built that could hold people. Stories. Versions of herself she never thought she'd meet. And it didn't need a deed, because it lived everywhere she went. Inside her. Whole. Healed. And home. If you've ever felt pressure to buy before you were ready. If you've ever stayed silent about a financial mistake because you thought it defined you, let Natalie's story remind you. You're allowed to pause. You are allowed to pivot. You are allowed to build a life that fits you, not the one you were told to chase. This is Money 101 Mondays, where we turn pressure into clarity and myths into tools. So here's your next step. Subscribe to Dollar by Dollar for more real financial stories told without shame. Share this episode with someone who needs to know they're not behind. They're just becoming aware. Comment below. What does home mean to you? Is it something you own or something you carry? Let's redefine wealth together. Not in square feet, but in sovereignty. Because your freedom, it doesn't need a deed. It just needs your permission.